I've thought about calling myself a free speech absolutist a lot, given it a lot of thought, and obviously it's not as simple as using these three words together. It carries a whole lot of meaning, whole lot of nuance, and a whole lot of rhetoric. But the more I think about it, the more I'm convinced that it is this absolute freedom of speech and expression is what actually justifies, the dignity of being a human in society. As usual, there is a lot to unpack in today's episode, but before we get started, please make sure that you subscribe to my channel and press the notification icon so that you don't miss out on any of my future episodes. Now, talking about free speech, I choose to work from the assumption that every single human being has the basic common sense, the basic dignity and respect, and the know how of how to use words and the language at his or her disposal when they're expressing and communicating with a fellow human being. Now, obviously, this does not mean that I'm painting the society black and white. It also does not mean that I'm negating the possibility of someone wantingly and knowingly using hateful words. But usually, I have found that when I'm trying to think about answers or solutions to questions or problems of our world and of our society, it's always very helpful when I start from a point of positivity and a point of optimism, because I feel that it gives a much more wholesome answer. And so when it comes to free speech and freedom of expression, I choose to operate from the assumption that, as I said, every human being has the basic decency and the know-how to make sure that the fellow human beings with whom they're communicating are not actually harmed and discriminated against. Now, when we start looking at the other side, which is censorship, we all have seen and know that censorship of any amount or censorship of any kind is eventually going to start pushing at the wrong buttons. The minute there is censorship of any kind, in any minute way, we will have to let go of our right to opinions. We will have to let go of our right to our own views. And especially if you look at in today's climate, if the view is not a view held by the majority, or in some cases, the views held by the minority, then it doesn't matter whether our views and opinions are actually formed out of common sense and out of knowledge. They will automatically be considered wrong or hateful and discriminatory. Censorship of any kind takes away the nuance of right and wrong, takes away the nuances of morality, because how and where do you begin to question it then? How do you start to actually seek answers? And how do you actually start to seek the truth? Secondly, there is the problem of practicality. So how exactly do you define hate speech? How exactly do you gauge the sensitivity of the person with whom you're speaking to so that you can design your words and your conversations in a way that is not deemed to be hateful or discriminatory by them? How exactly do you go and do that? And especially again, in today's political climate and social discourse, for example, if I'm going in a bus and a stranger smiles at me, do I have the right to say that I found that smile condescending and it felt like that person was showing pity on me because of the way I dress or my hair or who I am for that matter? And would it be valid if I considered that smile as hateful or discriminatory? Obviously this is a very extreme example, but then this is what makes you think about the nuances of how exactly do you gauge hate, discrimination, offense, especially when it is not direct like it was a couple of years ago or a few decades ago. And as I said, in today's discourse, anything and everything can be considered to be as offensive. So how exactly do you actually start to have a conversation with someone? If you're having to walk on eggshells all the time, or if you feel that the person in front of you who's trying to speak to you is walking on eggshells all the time, is it actually conducive to having like a meaningful exchange or a conversation with anyone? And even if you look at a lot of these real life examples, especially in the UK happening right now, it really makes you question about the validity of what these non-crime hate incidents are and if they are actually valid. So, for example, there is a barrister and a free speech campaigner by the name of Sarah Fillmore who recently had this experience where she was investigated by the police for tweeting, quote, "My cat is a Methodist," end quote. There was this other journalist called Alison Pearson who was investigated for a tweet made over a year ago for its potential to incite hatred against a specific community. I will allow you to judge these incidents and I will not go into dissecting each one. You please let me know in the comments what you think this was all about and whether it was valid and it was necessary. But I do want to talk about one more. I found this as the most bizarre of all. It was when a 9-year-old was being investigated for a word that he used against his classmate. And there was a similar one where 2 girls were investigated for saying that their friend smelled like fish. And given the whole situation, I personally still cannot fathom the need for police to have been involved in this. Now, was the comment about the friend smelling like a fish okay? Well, I think I would need a bit more context, because when I was in school, me and a couple of my friends would throw around really preposterous comments at each other, but none of them were inspired out of hatred or racial hatred or any other kind of discrimination or differences between us, all done in the name of friendship. But as I said, it would need a bit more context. Like, was there physical assault as well? Was this a regular occurrence where a particular student was constantly being targeted by these 2 girls? So you need to obviously have all these nuances. Even given all of that, wouldn't the teacher and the headmistress have been able to kind of handle it? Because that's what the teachers are there for, right? You are responsible to mold the language of students, the expression of students, because obviously they're 9-year-olds, they need to be taught. I would personally actually question whether all 9-year-olds have the time or the energy to think of racial hatred or discrimination. That's truly, I think, not the age where children are really concerned about all of this. I might be wrong, I don't know what the current generation is about. But to be honest, I don't think that's the case. But for the police to be involved in this kind of investigating classroom jibes and classroom insults, it seems a bit too far-fetched to me. And as I said, then what is the job of the teacher and the headmistress there? If you have to involve the police for every single thing, including a classroom jibe by a 9-year-old, then what are the other adults doing in society? Would probably be my main question, I guess. I do want to end this episode with this interview that I recently saw.
The Home Office is now reviewing how police record non-crime hate incidents, while police forces across the country say they're acting in a proportionate way. But is investigating non-crime hate incidents a good use of police time? Well, we're joined now by political commentator Andy Williams. Andy, thanks ever so much for joining me. My understanding is that you are in support of the recording of non-crime hate incidents. Is that correct?
I am in certain circumstances. I think I'm not a free speech absolutist. I don't think that people should have the right to say absolutely whatever they think or feel on social media platforms like X. On platforms like that, you have a responsibility. You are a publisher. And I think you need to be thoughtful about what you say. And if you're promoting hate speech...
Retreating and coming back to the very first point that I made, Andy Williams is obviously not starting from the assumption that people have the responsibility, people are innately aware of the language that they use and of how to use their freedom on social media platforms. So he's starting from this assumption that people don't know how to, make use of their access to social media. Anyway, let's continue.
If you're inciting violence, inciting racial hatred or otherwise, I think that's a problem. However,
well, obviously, we need to make the distinction where some speech are on the face of it, you don't need a debate to understand that some speech is definitely inciting hatred, definitely inciting violence, and definitely discriminatory. And again, I would reiterate that every single person is aware enough to know when that happens. The problem rises and the question comes up when that same rule is applied to vague incidents, to incidents where there is much more nuance, and maybe where the intention is not really to incite racial hatred or any discrimination for that matter.
Sorry, Andy, just to clarify the point. So, of course, incitement to violence is already illegal. A lot of the problem comes when it comes to defining this term hate speech. Can you tell us what you mean by hate speech?
Well, I think gets to the heart of the problem, is that different people would give you a different answer to that question, which is why I am in favour of a review with caveats. I'm in favour of a review of hate laws, because I don't think even police forces are on the same page on this issue. My concern is that this could end up being a politically charged, politically motivated review. Kemi Badenoch obviously has her own idea of what a good outcome of that review would look like, and I'm sure Keir Starmer does too. So what I think we need is an independent review with independent people from an independent body to look at it from scratch. In short, my definition of hate speech would be anything that is, and I know that sort of inciting racial hatred or violence is already a separate law, but anything that is manifestly hateful. Now, the problem is that different people have different views about what that is. So I do accept that it's tricky, it's a grey area.
That's the problem, isn't it? Because you've just given me a circular definition, which...
Bingo, it is a circular definition. As I said, there are certain instances where it is very obvious that it is hate speech and it is discriminatory, so that should be shut down immediately. But when it comes to other incidents, as I said, if somebody smiles at me, can I consider that to be condescending and therefore hateful towards me? Would that be valid? Of course not. I mean, I hope not. I hope we don't end up in a society that eventually becomes that very sensitive unnecessarily.
Of course, is not usable in law. So
I'm just going to stop once more here. To me personally, I think the only way you can define this, if you really want to define it, is through the use of common sense. If it is not logically, apparently, obviously hateful, then it shouldn't be treated as a non-crime hate incident.
We've had the European Court of Human Rights, we've had UNESCO all say it's not really possible to agree on a mutually agreed definition of hate speech. That being the case, given the problems you've just outlined very clearly about the potential politicisation of this, wouldn't it be just best if the police didn't get involved in what citizens of the UK say and think?
Well, I don't think the status quo is viable, because there's obviously a difference of opinion between police forces. There's a difference of opinion between politicians and the police. There needs to be, I think, some really clear guidance laid down. I don't think you can just say, oh, put it in the too difficult box, it's complicated, and run away from the problem. I'll give you an example. I was on a train about an hour ago, and some people who'd left the England-Ireland game early were chanting about the IRA. They were chanting in favour of Tommy Robinson. Now, is that hate speech? I'm not sure, but certainly it's something that I think is unacceptable in a public place to be chanting, because it was clearly aggressive. They were clearly making a point.
Just because something is aggressive doesn't mean it is automatically hateful or discriminatory, but I digress. Let's continue.
A racist point in terms of Tommy Robinson, and I think that's a real challenge. So how do we police, and I mean police in terms of literally police forces, but also how do we define these complicated areas?
I think the question, Andy, though, is who gets to decide? I mean, a lot of people would say that they don't find those sorts of chants offensive, and that maybe some chants that might be more in line with your political views, they would find offensive. So how do you set up an arbiter who can be completely impartial and can sort of overview the very notion of what hate might be?
I don't have a great answer to that question. I think it's obviously there's a challenge in finding the definition of independent.
Again, I reiterate, that independent body that would review this, the arbiter in between, would be basic common sense and logic. That's all.
Would again vary depending on who you spoke to, but as far as possible, I think we need to find a way through this. I don't think we can just say, walk away. People should be allowed to say and do whatever they feel like. As I say, I'm not a free speech absolutist. I don't think that works in practice.
I think that free speech absolutism is the only thing that would work in practice. There will obviously be incidents of actual hate and discrimination, obviously, because as I said, human nature, you'll never have a perfect society. But then to rob humans of the basic dignity, of their basic freedoms, would probably be much more detrimental than giving them complete freedom.
I think we have to be mindful of the impact that speech has on other people, and therefore we need to find a way through this complicated problem.
So which do you feel is more of a risk, just historically speaking? People saying things that others find offensive, or empowering the state to incarcerate citizens for what they say?
Well, I think that's a false dichotomy. I don't think it's one or the other. Obviously, I'm not in favour of a thought police.
But that's exactly what is happening. When you have 9-year-olds being investigated, what exactly does that mean?
1984 style state where we are locking people up for posting things or publishing things that we don't agree with. But I think there have to be limits. I really, really strongly feel there have to be limits. If you are doing and saying things that are just manifestly causing problems in society, and I'm not just talking about upsetting people, but I'm talking about having an impact on people that is just way beyond their, what is acceptable.
So I think we should dig down into that. So that's very interesting. So you've drawn a distinction between purely offensive speech, which I think we can probably agree on balance can't really be policed because it's too subjective, to actual real world harm.
So if you were to have limits, then it would mean you would have to have limits on every religion. You would have to have limits on the language that every specific race uses and the way that every specific race uses the language. You would have to have limitations on how a specific gender would use language. Then you would have to have separate rules for every single distinction within society, wouldn't you? Let me know in the comments what you think about this. Obviously, with social media, what has happened is that the conversations which we would have otherwise probably had with, just our family members or maybe our friends group, now is actually a conversation that we are having with a potentially global audience. So it is an expansion of how many people are actually listening to what we say. So I think that is the major problem here. So would it be okay for somebody to go to jail for example, for misgendering somebody else? Would it be okay for somebody to, I don't know, I read this somewhere, I might be wrong, but apparently it was considered to be offensive to ask somebody where they are from? Where exactly do you draw the limits to this? How exactly are you supposed to strike up a conversation with someone else when you're not even able to ask where you are from to someone? Thank you all so much for joining me today on this episode. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are, what your views are. And until next time, take care.